So I was originally going to do this video strictly on conversation with dyspraxia. Although talking about that, it's kind of jarring, especially when you notice the specific conversation flaws as you're recording your videos. And so while I am going to talk a little bit and reference a little bit on how dyspraxia does affect speech in this video, to some extent, I am going to leave a Reddit thread in the description for further reading. There's actually some really good things there about, about how dyspraxia does affect speech. And again, I will touch on it, and it's not necessary reading to go into this video, but it is very good further reading, especially if you are more interested in the different things that dyspraxia does to affect just how social flow and conversation tends to happen with dyspraxia. So while this video is going to be talking about, social cues and just having a general social life when you're living with dyspraxia, I will not be talking about romantic relationships in this video. That's actually the video planned for next week, so just keep that in mind. So one of the hardest things to do with dyspraxia, especially when it is very heavily verbal, is having just any real interpersonal relationship, whether it be romantic or platonic or whatever, even just talking to coworkers or customers at a job, you tend to get a little scatterbrained, especially when you're trying to convey what you're trying to say to somebody else. You may notice in my videos I do tend to stall a little bit, and I do tend to just kind of pause. And that's simply because with dyspraxia, the connections between the brain and whatever appendage or sense or whatever you're using tends to be mixed up or stalled and delayed. And so when you build a conversation or when you're talking to somebody and they say something to you and you're planning a response as they're talking, you almost have to plan your response ahead while they're talking. Because if you wait until they finish saying what they're going to say, you spend a couple minutes just paused while they're waiting for you to respond, just absorbing what they've said to you and then putting together what you were planning on saying and then bringing that to your mouth so you can speak it. And while this process may seem simple to just about the average person, with dyspraxia, it's almost stalled. It's one of those things that, may not seem as noticeable if you're in conversation and you're not paying attention to it, especially if it's a really good conversation. You still may find yourself both interrupting or bringing up something in the conversation that just may not be relevant to what they just said, simply because you're taking a keyword from what they just said and running off of that. It's not that you weren't paying attention. You definitely heard everything they said. And if you took the minute to stop and think, you would definitely have absorbed it all right away, but instead you're kind of taking it as you're talking. And when dealing with a relationship with, say, a coworker or a friend, to them it may appear as you, say, being arrogant or wanting to talk over them when that isn't your intention to begin with. Another big part of this is that a lot of us do have empathy, like really strong amounts of empathy. It comes with just being, well, essentially disabled in some way. We tend to empathize with others. And so, in order to show that we understand their struggle, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, or I understand, or I'm sorry, because those are just two words. And the amount of complexity that our brain takes to understand things, saying something as simple as I'm sorry or okay, it just doesn't sound right. And again, to a misinformed person or someone who's just not as understanding, this again comes off as rather arrogant or, uppity, because it seems like you're trying to undermine what they just said when in all actuality you're just over explaining yourself. this isn't entirely a negative, because the fact that dyspraxia does make you focus on all the small little details that go into something, it actually kind of makes you come off as more intelligent to some people, although trying to sound too intelligent will also make you look like a jackass too. And so while you may be a little bit more aware of what they're saying or what their surroundings are, and it's almost like viewing the world through an HD lens. That's the best way I've found to describe having dyspraxia. It's it's hard. It really is. And you may have noticed that I've just completely cut off what I was originally saying. And that's another thing that dyspraxia is probably the worst with, is just memory in general. And I've also mentioned this in a previous video, that a lot of the reason why it seems like we talk too much, or we go on tangents, or we ramble all the time, is simply because we may have started out talking about something and then have completely forgot about the original context of it as we started talking. And then we go on and on and on until we are basically going from talking about elephants to having a conversation about flamingo beach towels. Don't get me wrong, we definitely make the connections. It's just the connections we make are within such a short time period that we're basically like reading a Wikipedia article and clicking the blue link every couple of times until you're on a completely different article. What is that called? It's like Wikipedia surfing or something. So basically, talking to someone with dyspraxia is essentially like going on a massive Wikipedia binge. And that makes it really hard to have a social life sometimes, because you do come off as being somewhat nerdy and somewhat arrogant, even though that's not your intention at all. If anything, you're thinking more positively and trying to be empathetic, but explaining why you are the way you are, it makes it even more difficult, especially with how unknown dyspraxia is. So I find that a lot of people with dyspraxia do tend to have just really close-knit communities of friends, like maybe 2 or 3 friends and a girlfriend or something like that. And there's a lot of things that go into that. It's not just dyspraxia. I mean, going through any sort of trauma, or just having trust issues or abandonment issues on top of that also. Not saying that anyone watching this does, but if you do have those issues, this can also be another prominent thing, is just the isolation, that on top of the fact that dyspraxia does enhance anxiety as well. It just makes for a big clusterfuck when it comes to managing a social life. And another thing that I don't think a lot of people realize, especially people with dyspraxia, is that a lot of people don't really have that many close friends. While it may seem like someone's social and they recognize a lot of people, not everyone is really their close friend. Even in the non-dyspraxic brain, it's been proven that you can only have a selective amount of actual friends that you can keep in touch with and organize and keep memories on. And with how dyspraxia affects memory, and how much or how little you can really compress and understand with your brain, especially with the short-term memory being an issue, you can only manage so many friends at once, and you end up finding yourself keeping a bunch of really close friends that you're just really close to. And then you throw the empathy on top of that, and you find that although your friendships aren't as big as what it may seem like for the average person, you find yourself actually really closer to a lot of your friends. And this can create some more anxiety, especially if they don't consider you as close a friend as, say, someone else. But, you do have your best friends. And I've mentioned in the Getting Help with Dyspraxia video, having a social circle and just having just that one major group of people who understand what you're going through. And I think, while I do like to give some tips in my videos, I think it's more of just remembering the fact that not everyone has a whole lot of friends. It's not any way it seems. We have thousands, hundreds upon thousands of Facebook friends. And out of all of them, there's probably only about 5 of them we actually regularly keep up with on a daily basis, maybe even less. And so, it's important to remember that while it may seem like you don't have as many friends as everyone else, no one really does. It's just appearances can be deceiving, and I think a lot of us do on the down low know that. But alongside anxiety comes depression, and when it comes to dealing with depression, it's very easy to see a low friend count as a negative. And another thing, especially when dealing with friends and just people who are close to you, is I've found one of the biggest problems with dyspraxia, even in those where it's not as verbally intense, is just picking up on certain social cues where, finding a tone of voice to match whatever the other tone of voice speaking to you is just hard, especially recognizing what that tone of voice is. If it's slightly louder than usual, it may be joy or anger. But on top of understanding what they're saying, trying to come up with what you're trying to say, and then also trying to read both body language and tone and voice cues and social cues and all that, it becomes so blundered up that once you've come up with how you're going to respond to a conversation, you end up just kind of blurting it out. You don't really care about the volume of your voice. You don't really care how it comes off. It's not that you don't care, it's just that your brain can only put together so much of a sentence without reading too much into it. Otherwise, you get like information overload and then anxiety, and well, that's a mess. So I do find that another thing that can help people with dyspraxia is being open about having dyspraxia. Now, I don't mean just going around to everyone you know and trying to lecture them about your disorder, because that is arrogant. But I mean when you first meet somebody and you take a liking to them, whether it's in a relationship way or a friendship way, and you get to know each other, you get a little bit more personal, whether you smoke together or whatever, bring it up in passing, or if you drop something and you want to try to explain it, just say, oh, hey, I have dyspraxia. And when they ask about it, I mean, there's loads of resources online. There's obviously my videos. That's what I usually do, which I'll just send them a link to my first video on this topic, but, shameless plug. But there's other YouTubers like Crystal Bella Shaw, as well as there's a Dyspraxia Foundation page, and just informing them. I mean, we can always use a little bit more awareness with dyspraxia, especially here in the United States. So, just making sure they understand, and especially if it's someone who you're looking to have a serious relationship with, it's also important to get out of the way. So if you do end up living together, they're understanding why you're leaving lights on and leaving dishes in the sink. It's not because you're lazy, it's, well, because you forgot. But talking about serious romantic relationships is actually the next video, which is going to happen next week. I'm also going to be doing a video on the benefits of dyspraxia as well. I'm actually working on that one. I've been working on that one for a couple weeks now, just because I'm trying to take what negatives there are to dyspraxia and kind of flip them on their head, because it does seem like for every thing that happens, there's a negative side and a positive side. And when it's a disorder like dyspraxia, we tend to focus so much on the negatives, but I really do want to highlight that there are some benefits. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses, even us with dyspraxia. So it's always important to remember that. And especially when you're in a social situation, you feel like you're worthless, or you feel like you can't talk to anyone, or you feel like you have no conversation skills at all, it's important to remember that even socially, you do have some benefits. Like, for instance, the intelligence thing. While you may come off as somewhat of a nerd, you do tend to be a little bit more intelligent. And especially when we have the physical problems that we do, sports and other weightlifting and just things that require coordination, balance, and hand-eye coordination as well, it just tend to be a problem. So we tend to just compensate by being more artistic, more logical, or even just more diplomatic, and we tend to improve our speech over time. I mean, while I may make some social problem things. You know, I do stutter in my videos. A lot of editing goes into that too. I do find that when it comes to explaining myself and just the fact that dyspraxics in general tend to almost over explain, we end up just being so well spoken because we just come up with all these words to explain such simple concepts that we almost come off as understandable, almost like an observational comedian. And it also seems like a lot of dyspraxics like myself end up in fields like comedy and politics simply because we're just that good at explaining the world around us because we're so used to having to explain it to ourselves and understand simple concepts. And with the excellent long-term memory, such complexities in simple everyday life just come naturally to us. And so it's almost like we do have somewhat of an increased intelligence, or at least an increased awareness of the world around us. While our spatial awareness isn't the best, our awareness of what actually exists in this world does seem to be more amplified, so to speak. And I guess that's the thing that you should take away from this video. And if anyone is really giving you any trouble about how you speak or how you walk or how you can't catch things, not in a joking way, but in a really demeaning or mean way, it's probably not someone you want to keep around anyway. It's important to remember that some people are ignorant and it's not their fault. It really isn't. You know, we're all raised in different environments and situations, and I think a big reason of why I hid my dyspraxia for so long is just because of where I grew up, in a place where it was just so misunderstood and still considered on the autism spectrum at the time. You know, and there's still so much to be learned about it. And so, I mean, it's easy to understand why people faced with ignorance or faced with things they don't understand tend to react with anger or with meanness. But really, it's just ignorance. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just you try to distance yourself from those people, or you try to educate those people if you can. And if you can't, well, it's not worth fighting for. There are too many good people out there that actually don't like to consider what you say and what you feel. And there's a lot more to people than what you think, and there's a lot more nice people out there than you think there are. Don't be afraid to test the waters with anybody, really. Don't be afraid to have a conversation with somebody new, because you never know if that person may become a best friend or maybe even something more. Thanks for watching, everyone. I know this video was kind of all over the place, but I'm talking about dyspraxia and social life. Two of the most disorganized things in humanity. Have a good one, everybody.